welcome to today's panel discussion, Reshoring and the EU Chips Act. As the electronics supply chain realigns, the panel will discuss the EU Chips Act and its ability to meet the industry's supply chain needs. Joining me today, I have Alison James from IPC. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And next to her, we have Arno Kolk, who's president of the Estonian Electronics Association. Welcome, Arno.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and then on the end we have Keith Bryant from Keith Bryant Consulting, essentially, who is also going to chip in on some of the global changes that have been happening.
Hi.
Hi, Keith. Okay, good. So let's get straight in with my very first question, and that is, what are some of the potential challenges or barriers to reshoring in the electronics manufacturing industry? And we'll start, we'll be nice, we'll start with the ladies first. so Alison, do you have an input on that?
Challenges with reshoring the electronics industry.
Yes.
I think there are probably many challenges for the industry, and well, reshoring. The CHIPS Act is a very good start for the semiconductor industry. So we definitely need a framework of policies in place that are supportive of the electronics industry as a whole. That means the semiconductor industry, but the entire supply chain.
Yeah.
So I think we have a very good start with the CHIPS Act. We didn't have that before, but a lot more needs to be done. So challenges are more support for the rest of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
The industries which are not necessarily in focus of the CHIPS Act. We really need a very strong supply chain in Europe. We need to support and build our printed circuit board industry, our EMS industry, so that we can also package and assemble the chips that are built in Europe. So there's that. But then, of course, there's a competitive situation and environment in Europe for manufacturing.
Right.
So again, it needs to be an environment where people and companies are able to invest and sustainably invest.
Yes.
So there's really a lot more that needs to be done. We're in, I think, at a good start, but a lot more needs to be done.
Yeah, there's a lot of elements to the CHIPS Act or ramifications off of it. It's not just the supply of PCBs, assemblies, and semiconductors. But there's also a lot of other things that are happening. There's a lot of de-risking going on in the supply chain and realignment happening that way. There's other things coming in, as you mentioned, like ESG and sustainability. So there's a lot of things happening at one time. Do you have a view on this, Arno?
Yeah, of course I agree with Alison that the CHIPS Act is a nice first step in that direction, and obviously you cannot build electronics without chips these days, so it's a must. But there are other parts of it, and even if we build manufacturing plants, assembly plants in Europe, and we can get the equipment, the whole supply chain must also follow. And a lot of the supply chain has moved to Asia, and even if you assemble in Europe, you have to import all the components. So the component industry probably is the next step, as are the PCBs. Europe is really a very small player now when it comes to the bare boards, and we need to change that.
Well, that's right. The US is maybe, I think, 4% of the world's PCBs. Sorry, 5%, and I think Europe is 4%.
I think it's about 2.
Oh, 2.2%.
Yeah.
Wow, that's tiny. So I mean, that's going to be a huge job to bring in PCB companies or ramp up PCB companies, because it's not just the materials and the laminates and the factories to make PCBs, but you need the copper rolling mills and things like that to back it up. So it is really a very complicated supply chain there. So there's a lot involved. Keith, you spent some time in the PCB industry a while ago, but I mean, I'm sure you know close at hand exactly what's involved in that.
Yeah, I mean, when I started in the PCB industry, there were 383 companies registered as having the ability to make boards in the UK.
That was in the UK alone, yeah.
And now there's probably about 20.
Yes.
And, you know, we've moved everything to China, and we're completely dependent on them.
Right.
You know, if you look at the contract manufacturers reshoring from Asia back into Europe, they're still buying their boards from China.
Yes.
And, you know, as everyone has rightly said, to put that in place, it's just for circuit boards. You know, it's an immense undertaking.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the biggest problem is, you know, even if you can do everything, it's having the skilled people.
Yes.
because that's what we've lost. And all the people who were making boards when I was young are old like me now. And we don't have the skill set, we don't have the knowledge. We still have some really good leading edge circuit board makers here. But as you say, it's if we want to move 20% of the global volume back into the UK, we've got to find 18% of the board manufacture.
Right, definitely. So, anyway, I mean, how might reshoring and the semiconductor initiatives in Europe impact the global semiconductor industry? Do you want to address that? I mean, you're working with the CHIPS Act in Brussels.
So we're working with the CHIPS Act in Brussels, and the CHIPS Act has now been formally adopted. The implementation is beginning. With regard to the global semiconductor industry, every major region is putting in place an equivalent to the CHIPS Act. And I think that all regions are in alignment, that there is not one region that will have all aspects of the value chain, but you need to make sure in electronics that you have what you need in the region for resiliency purposes.
Right.
So beyond the scope of the CHIPS Act, again, I think we need to bring it back to what else is needed in addition to the chips that will now, and the foundries and the factories that will be built in Europe. Again, you need more than that. You need the supply chain that can support that. So none of this is about reshoring all of the industry, but there is a need in each region to make sure that you have what you need for your industry. So that means semiconductors, but also the printed circuit boards and the assembly companies who can assemble that.
Well, this is it. I mean, the CHIPS Act as a name is probably a misnomer, because, I mean, it really should be the EU Electronics Act, so that you're getting all aspects of it. You're getting the OSATs, you're getting the PCB companies, as you say, you're getting all the different people involved. Do you see the reason that a lot of these other countries are pursuing their own version of the CHIPS Act, if you like, as a strategic initiative, because they see electronics as a strategic part of their future growth?
Regions certainly do see electronics, they see semiconductors as a strategic industry. And we believe, and we strongly believe, there needs to be much more recognition that electronics manufacturing as a whole is a strategic industry. In fact, we may not have time to talk about this today, but we've IPC and many organizations, including the Estonian Electronics Industry Association, we've been working together, and we've had a dialogue with the European Commission exactly on this, about the strategic importance of electronics manufacturing. Right. So I think that that understanding of the strategic importance of semiconductors is there, but again, a lot more needs to be done to reinforce the industry and the electronics industry as a whole with a full electronics industrial strategy.
Right. Okay. Arno, as president of the Estonian Association, I mean, you actually have a much wider reach than just Estonia. I mean, you seem to cover a lot of the Scandinavian countries up there, or have an awareness of it. How do you see the industry up in that part of the world? Is there not is there any PCB companies? Well, there are a few up there. But are there any sort of OSATs or what's missing?
Well, there are a few PCB companies up in Northern Europe, one in Estonia as well. It's not enough, obviously, because all these companies are focusing on some niche areas. Some RF for very complex things, or in Estonian case, prototypes and quick turnaround, small batches. So it's something which can be done competitively in that region today. But electronics industry in general is playing a ever increasing role, because in EU we talk about twin transition, digital and green transition, and you cannot be digital without electronics. I mean, electronics, all these bits, they are residing inside electronics. Right. Likewise, green transition is to a very large extent about controlling your processes, optimizing, measuring, and precise control, so you don't waste anything, or you don't do anything unnecessary. All these solar panels, windmills, smart grids, it's all electronics.
Right.
And so it's not possible to do the twin transition without having electronics industry in place.
Absolutely. Keith, I mean, you're a world traveler all the time. You travel a lot in Asia. You travel a lot in United States and other parts as well. What do you see are the main challenges for the European industry in trying to have an end-to-end supply chain?
Well, if we go back to the CHIPS Act, I mean, it's a great theory.
Mm-hmm.
We were in India 5-6 weeks ago.
Yep.
They also have their version of the CHIPS Act.
Mm.
And we interviewed a company who have already decided they're going to put in 12 OSAT lines. And there are 4 or 5 other companies that we know there who are already jumping on the Make in India bandwagon for semiconductor, and a lot of things are happening. You know, there's one company I spoke to this week just to check my facts, and they're planning to spend $20 million. And they will have, in their view, in 2.5 years, a Make in India chip that is Make in India right the way through.
Right.
Now, the lady on my right can correct me, but I think the CHIPS Act is about $40 billion.
For 43 billion, more or less, euros.
So that's twice what one company in India are spending commercially themselves
Right.
to set up OSATs and set up fab and manufacturing site. So while yeah, it's a good thing, for me it's not enough. And you know, we all know the statistics. We have the bulk of the R&D, we have the bulk of the chip design, we have a little bit of MPI, and we have something like 3% of the manufacture. So I'd like to see the CHIPS Act focusing on how soon can we get some OSATs up and running, so that at least we can get onto the ladder and get things moving.
Yeah.
And there doesn't seem to be maybe it's the knowledge or maybe it's the focus. But
well,
that's
you
what
know,
I would like to see.
yeah, okay. So coming back to your point on India, I mean, I think that's more. I look at India as a separate case for a couple of reasons, but one of the principal reasons it's driving it is taxation and the incentives from the government.
Yep.
The government has to puts in place the incentives to make industry react, as it were.
Yeah. And it's always been that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, they're not only putting incentives in place, but they're also putting restrictions in place. In other words, a couple of weeks ago, they stopped allowing laptops and notepads and that sort of thing to come into the country. They put heavy taxation on them.
Yeah.
They did a big deal with aerospace industries for a bunch of planes, but 30% of these planes have to get built in India.
Yeah.
So they're being protective as well as giving the incentives.
Yeah.
So I look at them as a slightly separate case to what's happening here in Europe.
Oh, I look at it as, unfortunately, a completely separate case. But for me, what they're doing is better than currently what we're doing. You know, you forgot to mention, but there's also an import tax. If there's a piece of capital equipment that is built in India and someone's trying to import a competitive product, they pay an import tax.
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, India is really, really pushing its growth. And that's why, you know, the Make in India process started in 2014. It's still going strong. And, you know, the India manufacturing sector is growing year on year. And we kind of need that, you know, the same push.
We're digressing into another area, but it is an interesting area, so I'm going to talk about it for a second. I mean, I interviewed a company this morning that's actually making inspection equipment, and most of the inspection equipment is getting built in India, and they're just sending the cameras and the important stuff out there.
Sorry, Trevor, I wasn't trying to digress. I was just drawing a parallel and saying
I understand.
This is what we should be doing.
But what I'm saying, what I'm about to say is that the same thing is happening in Mexico. There's a couple of companies I interviewed a couple of weeks in Mexico, you know, a US company and a German company that are doing manufacturing down there, not just for the Mexico market, but to send here to Europe.
Yep. And
the reason for that is that the Mexican government has more free trade agreements with other countries than any other country in the world. So it's easy for companies to get their goods in and out without tax. So the effect that government has, or the input that government has on this from a taxation point of view and everything else, is and through tariffs or through free trade agreements, is huge. So, you know, the companies, when they're looking at making these decisions, where they're going to locate and where they're going to manufacture, take into account all of these factors. So do you think the European Union should be doing more to try and make it more attractive?
I think we certainly all agree that the European Union, that more needs to be done in Europe. It's always complicated in Europe, right? We don't have the budget in the European Union that maybe some other regions have. It's also Brussels, the European Union. I mean, there are areas of national competence and there are areas of European competence. It's a very complicated decision-making process. But the bottom line is, yes, as Arno said, electronics are critical for the digital transition, for the green transition. And in order to make sure that we have what we need in Europe, it certainly needs to be a climate which is conducive to investment for companies.
Yeah.
And I think there's definitely, I know there is a growing realization that that there is a burden, that it's not necessarily an easy environment for investment. And the European Commission, thankfully, if we look at their priorities coming forward next year, they recognize the regulatory burden. They know that reporting obligations are a heavy administrative burden on companies.
Yeah.
They're looking to see how to reduce that by 25%. We say it needs to be much more than that,
Yes.
but we very much welcome the direction that they're looking in. So there is a growing recognition, indeed, that there's a lot of burden in Europe. The next question is, how do you put together the jigsaw
To
of
try and make it
creating the
happen.
environment that helps the
Well, that's
industry?
right. I mean, and one of the issues in the European Union is that a lot of these decisions that are made in Brussels are then sent out for countries to implement at a local level. So there's all different levels of implementation and enforcement. Arno, I mean, Estonia itself is a very progressive country, or it has been in some of the initiatives it's brought forward recently. How are you finding it with regards to incentives for electronics manufacturing?
Well, on one hand, yes, we have very good incentives in place because our taxation is very friendly for any kind of business, because we don't have corporate tax unless you take out dividends. So basically, whatever you reinvest is tax-free, which of course helps that. On the other hand, there are still challenges, not only in Estonia, but Europe. As everybody has been telling me, that if you want to build new factory, like PCB factory, for example, it takes way more paperwork these days than it took some 20 years ago. And so that even if we give the green light today, it's going to take a while to get all the permits in place and get started. And then, of course, we have energy issues. What is the price? What is availability of energy? You cannot really run factories without stable and reasonably priced electricity, for instance.
Right.
So all these things also come into place. And we have labor issues, because obviously if we haven't built boards for many years, then there are no people who can do them, and there are no teachers who could teach them either.
Yes.
So we need to rebuild the whole system of education, vocational education, and also we need engineers, process engineers, who have to come from universities.
Absolutely. Well, I think the engineering problem, the labour problem, is a problem across the world at the moment. Quite frankly, it's happening everywhere, there's a huge amount of automation that's coming in to really try and cater for some of the shortages that we're having with labour. It's a fascinating debate, everybody, but I think we could go on on talking about this for a good time yet, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So I want to thank Keith Ryan on the end, Arno Kolk from the Estonian Electronics Association, and of course Alison James from IPC. So thank you for joining me today, and thank you for watching. We'll be back shortly with our next panel discussion.